Ms. Kuzmina for also helping me with behind the scenes, and it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And so I don't need to share my slides, correct? Perfect. All right, well, thank you so much once again. So starting with the title, it's a very long title. I apologize for that, but it contains some of the most important concepts. So you should know that I'm trained as a cognitive psychologist and cognitive scientist, so that the perspective I'm going to give you today is from a psychologist perspective, and we work very intimately with computer scientists and engineers and artificial intelligence researchers. And then based on the projects that I will show you today, we also work with our stakeholders, so they can be elementary school teachers, high school teachers, nurses, surgeons, engineers, etc. And really the goal of our research is to understand humans learning, reasoning, problem solving in STEM domains, also in biomedical domains. And once we understand that, then the question is, can we build technologies that are more intelligent? And so we'll spend some time talking about what does it mean for a system to be intelligent, okay? So, and then also if you look at the title, we also use the concept of self-regulated learning, which comes from psychology, learning sciences, and educational research, but also in computational sciences. And really fundamentally, self-regulated learning means that a person, a human, has the potential when learning, let's say with a technology, has a potential to monitor in real time their cognition, their metacognition, their emotions, right, and their motivation. And if you can monitor those, then when there are discrepancies, you should be able to regulate those. So regulation usually involves some kind of
Excuse me,
strategy.
Professor Azevedo, could you please not forget to say when it's next slide?
I'm sorry?
Could you please not forget say next slide?
Yeah, I'm still on the first slide.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And so that's kind of a little bit of background. And then in terms of the opportunities, so today we'll talk about some of the opportunities and also the challenges. And the question is, how do we use AI for teaching, learning, and assessment? And also, I have to thank the funding agencies, because the research that we do conduct is very expensive, if you will. It takes a lot of money because it has to basically includes many big teams, if you will. So funded mostly by the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Department of Education, NIH, and then when I was at McGill, it also some Canadian agencies. And more recently, we actually have several projects that are funded by the Jacobs Foundation in Germany, and also the EARLY that comes from Brussels. And that's and I'll talk a little bit about that. So next slide, please. So in terms of an overview, so I want to emphasize that there is a science of learning with that technology. A lot of people build technology or ask questions or design technology based on intuition. That is not a scientific basis for learning. There is a psychological basis, right, which forms a science of learning with technology. As I mentioned before, we are focusing on self-regulation. Sometimes self-regulation is also talked about as metacognition, and we'll talk about what some of those differences are. Because one thing is, can the human self-regulate or engage in metacognition? And if the human cannot do that for whatever reason, right? And the question is, can the system be intelligent enough, a learning technology, to support and foster metacognition or self-regulation? In our research, we also focus on what we call multimodal online trace data. So a lot of the research that is done in terms of the impact of technology is using pre-tests and post-tests on the content. So let's say it could be biology, it could be thermodynamics. The literature also includes a lot of self-report measures. So they ask people and students, you know, what is your perception of your metacognition when you're going to learn about something? And that's great, but that we must never forget, that's about perception. That is a student's perception or human's perception of their skills and knowledge. And we know that human perception is faulty. So what we tend to do is collect multimodal data. And today I'll show you some examples of multimodal data. And what that means is that when the human, the student, the learner, the professional is using a particular learning technology, we are then capturing some of these processes. We're capturing in real time. So we're capturing their eye tracking, their facial expressions of emotions, where they're paying attention, their physiology, their log files, etc. And I'll show some examples of that, because that's the real data that a human is exhibiting and enacting during learning, reasoning, etc. And we do this because we're also addressing not just the scientific aspects, but a lot of educational issues. So for example, we know that the US, for example, in PISA and OECD, we always score very poor compared to some European countries, some Asian countries, right? We have sometimes teacher training issues. So, for example, teachers are not always trained in the best and most up-to-date theories of psychology of learning, right? And so then we expect our children and kids and learners to be able to self-regulate and learn really optimally. Well, if you haven't been trained to teach students that, then what is the issue? And so the question is, can we help and design technologies to help teachers, help students become more adept, self-regulated learning? I'm going to give you some snippets of some current projects that we have and opportunities. And then we'll talk also about, meanwhile, the implications for researchers and learners. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So how do we start this? So because there is a science of learning, we start at the top in the orange box, right? So we have theories, models, and frameworks of self-regulation that we have co-designed and helped design. So these come from psychology, educational research, learning sciences, AI, computational modeling, etc. So we start with a theory, and I'll show you some examples in a couple of slides. Then we actually are studying in a particular context. So there's usually a particular learner of a specific age with specific skills using a particular technology. So it can be a game, it can be an intelligent tutoring system, it can be a simulation. I'm also going to show you some new technologies that we're using. They can be using robotics, etc. And then, of course, because we want to measure the impact, right, and figure out where AI can fit in, is that we're measuring self-regulation and learning, of course, and other measures, both prior to and following. But we're really focused on this talk is the during. That is where the multimodal data comes in, okay? What does your eyes tell us about what you're doing and allocating attention? What does the facial expression tell us about maybe things that are impeding you from learning and reasoning? And then we engage in the multimodal analysis. This is actually the bottleneck for our research. So while we use traditional statistic methods that everybody uses, regardless of your discipline, we also use some data mining approaches and machine learning approaches, okay? And then once we've learned, then we have an opportunity to go back and make that particular technology intelligent, okay? And we'll talk a little bit about what the intelligence means. When we go back to, for example, an educational perspective, intelligence, we, for example, go back to Vygotsky's work, right? Early work on scaffolding, right? So there's a zone of proximal development. Do we know what that is? How do we scaffold the learner? How do we foster self-regulation? When do we foster? Is the intervention for scaffolding, for example, effective? And how do we know that? And then we complete the cycle for and augment our learning theory. So that's a little bit of the cycle. And we try to apply that, given our research, right, is across humans of all ages. So it can be a 14-year-old child, can be an 18-year-old kid, can be a college student, can be a surgeon, a nurse, an engineer, a teacher, okay? Sometimes there are artificial agents, and sometimes it's across tasks, domains, and context. The context can be the laboratory. The context could be an emergency room, okay? The laboratory can also, or the context can also be a classroom, okay? So next slide, please. So then a little bit more in terms of introducing what self-regulation is across disciplines. So students are not only self-regulating, in other words, again, monitoring and regulating their cognition, affect, metacognition, motivation. But while they're doing that, and depending on the learning technology, they may also be required to read. So if I'm learning about the human circulatory system, well, I'm going to have to read about what a valve is, or what an atria is, or what the heart, or four chambers. Right? They may be having to write, right? They may have to problem solve. They may have to reason or understand a complex topic like Newton's second law of physics, or they may be collaborating. In some cases, they're collaborating. So what I'm showing you here in these little snippets of pictures is some of the work that we're doing, and I'll get into more examples later. So the top right, we're doing a lot of work in virtual reality and how students understand basic elements from the periodic table, and then how do they synthesize new compounds using virtual reality, and they're able to mix elements. This young lady here, working at home, represents typically, for example, what a student was doing during COVID, when they were not in the classroom, they didn't have access to their teacher, they didn't have access to their peers, they're working alone. So imagine the pressure on this student to be a very disciplined and strategic self-regulated learning to avoid all, in the absence of any instructional support. So the question is, can she really study and learn by herself? Does she have the self-regulatory skills and knowledge? And if not, then what is the role of AI, or potentially AI can do that? Sometimes the students are building robots together, so it's a little bit of a collaborative learning, collaborative problem solving. So we're looking at the discourse between the two humans. In this case, they're two agents, but they're human. Okay, you could see in the future where the robot actually is also an artificial agent, and the robot actually understands what the kids are saying and can actually be an equal partner in, so going from a dyad to a triad of learners. We do stuff in medicine in terms of using virtual reality also. And then on the bottom right, we also look and examine the role of teams, a team of 2, a team of 3, a team of 4, sometimes 5 in medicine, when in this case, the AI eventually in the future, right, is the high fidelity mannequin for medicine. In this case, you have 2 nurses who are learning how to practice the intubation and the management of a patient who is not doing very well medically. Right. So this is to show you the kinds of context and the kinds of technologies. So the technologies range from intelligent tutoring systems, VR, could be robotics. And in this case, the technology on the bottom right is also a high fidelity mannequin, because this mannequin will talk. This mannequin will react to things that you will do to the mannequin medically. Okay. And so on the left-hand side is a little bit of another walkthrough. So we start with a psychological construct, so learning or self-regulation. So we have to define it. We have to understand what processes we're interested in. When do they occur? The biggest problem is, how do we measure it? And the problem with educational technology in general that we see in the literature is that many people are designing technologies based on intuition, and they're forgetting that there is a psychology of learning underlying that has been around for decades. So we have to design technologies not based on intuition, but based on psychological principles of who the humans are, and match that with the affordances of the particular technology. So we're very, very focused on the measurement. How do we analyze that data that we collect, okay, from the humans and the human-machine interaction? And then, because I'm in the School of Modeling and Simulation, we also take the model. Like, so if we collect eye tracking data when a student is learning how to integrate text and diagrams as they learn about, let's say, how the blood functions through the heart, then the question is, can we take that eye tracking data and have an AI system be able to detect, just from the gaze behavior, if the student is actually integrating the text and the diagram adaptively, and are they really understanding what they learn, right? And if the system doesn't understand, the question is, what can the system do in terms of the AI, in terms of what it asks the student? Like, I don't understand why you keep persisting on going from the text to the diagram and back and forth so many times. Can you explain to me what you are doing? That's eventually the AI that we want to get to. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is not going to be a discussion on theory. Just want to make sure you, because we keep talking about theories, that this is just a very small subset of the theories of self-regulation, okay, that we draw from. And most of these are from North American and European colleagues who have designed this. They come from different fields. So the first one that you see going from left to right, the first one is the Winnie model. This is one of the leading models of self-regulation that really focuses, if you look at the middle of the diagram, it says control and monitoring. That is really one of the foci, so that the human is constantly monitoring and controlling or regulating, okay, based on many activities that are going on inside the head, all right, but also things that are outside that are out of your control. And that's the task conditions. So the question could be, do you have access to other instructional resources? Do you have access to, let's say, ChatGPT? Do you have access to a teacher, to peers, etc.? How does that impact? The one in the middle on the top is one on self-regulated learning, but co-regulated learning, that has been designed by one of our colleagues in Finland, Sanna Jarola, and her colleague Alison Hadwin from University of Victoria in Canada. The one on the bottom is emotion regulation, right? Because if we are able through AI to detect that the student is getting really frustrated and really confused because of the facial expressions of emotions, then the question becomes, how when should an AI, whether it's an avatar, an intelligent virtual human, a pedagogical agent, when should it intervene? And if it's going to intervene, what is it going to say? What is it going to do for that student? And we're still hardly missing a lot of information on what that process is. People talk about, oh, we should scaffold. Sure. But when do we scaffold? How do we scaffold? Why are we scaffolding? Is scaffolding effective? And so those are some of the critical questions that are also more pedagogically irrelevant. The one on the top right comes from cognitive psychology, really focusing on specific metacognitive processes and learning strategies. The one with the circles and the red arrows, that's the Mello and Gracer. So that is a very simplistic yet very eloquent model of cognitive disequilibrium that actually based on Jean Piaget's cognitive development model or theory. Okay, and then the bottom is Klaus Scher, who's in Switzerland, is the model of emotions that is based on the fact that when a human expresses emotions, it's multi-componential. So what that means is I can express my emotions through my speech, my face, right, my gestures, and also my physiology. And so the question is, if an AI system is going to focus on, let's say, affect or emotions, then we need to measure as much as possible the many ways that a human can express their emotions. It's not always just through the face, okay? So again, this is just a very short subset of some of the models that we use. We use many, many other ones, and some of those names that are under the title also are some of the names that we focus on and use. Next slide, please. So now if we focus specifically on advanced learning technologies for self-regulated learning, what I've done here is I'm showing you the top 6, if you will, models that focus on self-regulated learning, okay? We start from the top, from the left, okay? So this is a model by colleagues at North Carolina State University where they're learning algebra, and it's called SimStudent. So basically the student teaches this is a different paradigm for teaching and learning. The student is not learning from the technology. The student is teaching the technology, the simulated student, how to solve algebra problems. So it's a very different approach to teaching. The one on the bottom this is our colleagues at Vanderbilt University. Okay, this is called Betty's Brain. And this one is also similar. It's a learning by teaching paradigm, right? So there is a theory, a model in education, which is the best way to become an expert in an area is to learn it and then teaching it to someone else. So in this case, what the students do is they learn about ecology, and then they're teaching Betty by populating her brain, which you see here, right? What they've done is they populated the brain, Betty's brain, they're learning about ecology, and they're putting the concepts related to ecology, and then they're putting the causal links of how these concepts are related to each other. And then they have another student come and ask Betty questions. Well, Betty can only answer the questions correctly and understand what you're asking if the other student taught Betty all that knowledge. And so this goes into cycles of teaching, learning, assessment, teaching, learning, and assessment. Then in the middle of the top, we have Phil Winnie's G study. This one is about learning. So you can put any kind of content, text, and diagrams, and the students basically are highlighting. They're given learning goals, and they highlight. And the assumption is that students are highlighting things that they think are important. So the assumption is that they're metacognitively monitoring the importance and the relevance of text, right, that they're reading. And so they're leaving a trace, going back to our multimodal trace. So they're leaving a trace of what they've done. So then a teacher can go back and actually assess where, for example, the stuff highlighted in purple is relevant or not. The student can also then go back and revisit their notes, all right? And maybe, that stuff that was in purple, maybe half of that is actually relevant, and I can make the other stuff unrelevant. The bottom right is a serious game called Crystal Island that we use with our collaborators who developed it at North Carolina State University. Here, it's a completely different approach. Here, the focus is on agency. We know that for learners to be really excited and self-regulate, right, is to give them agency. But here's the issue. Not all learners, when given full control of their learning and instruction, most learners do not know how to take advantage of that. And we say that part of that is that they do not have the self-regulatory skills to be able to make good instructional decisions, okay, about the content and themselves. So what we have here is In this case, it's a serious game. So you land on an island. There's a biological outbreak, and this was developed over 10 years ago. So this really is related to COVID, but it's different. So here is a screenshot of the student can talk to the nurse, get some information, can talk to the patients, can talk to the scientist, can collect data, can analyze data, and then make inferences about what the source of this outbreak is. And you cannot leave the game until you correctly identify the source. So a completely different approach to teaching and learning, right? But still requires you to self-regulate. The one on the bottom right, okay, is BioWorld, which was developed by Suzanne Lajoie, actually my former mentor when I was a PhD student at McGill University. This one is for medical students. So the content here is to teach medical students how to diagnose, okay? So it goes through so they're learning about diagnostic reasoning in medicine while trying to self-regulate, okay? And then there's a top right, which is MetaTutor, which I'm going to describe in more detail in the next slides. So if we can have the next slide, please. So MetaTutor has been around for, my gosh, 15 years at least. So we developed MetaTutor when I was faculty at the University of Memphis. MetaTutor is a multi-agent environment. So MetaTutor uses 4 agents. So there's Mary the monitor, Sam the strategizer, Pam the planner, and Sam the strategizer, and Gavin the guide. So MetaTutor has many different features that have been developed. So the left hand is just a screenshot. So here you have the agent, Mary the monitor. Depending on what the student does, the student has different layouts. So for example, this is the most complicated layout because it has the overall learning goal. So we work with teachers and faculty sometimes in colleges to determine, if the student is going to use MetaTutor for, let's say, 60 minutes, what should be the overall learning goal? Then the students have their own learning goals that they develop. Here, it's just a snippet. They'll have text and diagrams, okay? And then there's the interaction between the students, and they have a table of contents. And then they can also indicate to this system using the self-regulation palette, what strategies I want to summarize now. Or if they go to content, it's like, oh, I know this already. So that's their way of telling the system about their metacognitive and learning strategies. So the system, using the limited AI that it has, does not have to make inferences that could potentially be wrong and basically skew the student into wrong pedagogical decisions, if you will. Okay. And so it's got many, many features. It's an interactive system. Last year, we presented a synthesis of all our work using multimodal data. So the motivation, the affect, the metacognition, and the cognitive strategies. This is co-authored with many of my former and current postdocs and grad students who are now faculty at different universities throughout the world. And this is a synthesis of what we've learned after 15 years of doing this work. MetaTutor is currently being used by us. We have collaborators also in India who are wanting to use MetaTutor to teach self-regulation. And then we also have colleagues at the University of Oviedo in Spain, where there is a Spanish version of MetaTutor that is being used with college students who have learning disabilities. For MetaTutor, we've also designed other types of MetaTutors. So the bottom here, bottom right that you see is a more controlled environment. So we've worked with medical staff, biology and chemistry, where we basically are asking students a very simple, what looks like a simple question. Explain where sodium and potassium move during electrical signaling in the nervous system. So we have text, right, that has been verified by the biochemist. We have a diagram that has been designed by her. And then we are basically looking at how we can use more relevant and facial expressions in virtual agents as the scaffolders who help the students make decisions about their metacognition, and actually in real time can make a detection as to whether the student is focusing on the wrong content or irrelevant content or aspects of the diagram. So in other words, to be there to scaffold the learner. Again, limited AI to a certain extent. All right, and now we can go to the next slide, please. So then you might be asking, so how do we collect this multimodal data? Because this is not just administering a questionnaire or a paper-based pre-test and post-test, okay? So the picture on the left really represents how in a controlled laboratory environment, when humans, students, learners, etc., come to our lab, this is the kind of data that we collect, okay, before I show you the data. So we collect physiological recordings. They're usually wearing a bracelet. We have different types of bracelet because we know what your baseline is. If there's a spike in arousal, okay, the question is the spike in arousal compared to your baseline pedagogically and psychologically relevant that a system, an AI system, should be able to detect? And if it detects, then the question becomes, what does the AI do for the learner? Does it just acknowledge, hey, I see from your physiology that, there's a heightened arousal. Is there something that you need or something that you don't understand? For example, right? There's log file data, anything that the mouse clicks, typing, okay, in some cases, touchscreen, anything that the student is doing in terms of those kinds of behaviors, gross level behaviors, are captured as log files at millisecond. Okay, we have the eye tracker. Okay, this is actually an older version of the eye tracker. We have multiple eye trackers, so they're collecting eye tracking data. So when a student is looking here, the student in the screen, this is actually a student using Crystal Island. So right now they're talking to the nurse, Kim, right here. So the question is, what is the student paying attention to based on their eye tracking behavior? Okay, and why? And then any kind of interaction between the learner and the human, okay, or the learner and the agent, in this case, Kim. We do screen capture because we cannot make inferences unless we have context. So, if we have the eye tracking data, or if you just had the verbalizations, but you had no screen recording, then it would be wrong to make certain assumptions about inferences. And then we have a Logitech camera. This is a very, cheap old camera that basically captures the face in real time. So we have a running video of the participant's face, okay? And in real time, we're analyzing their facial expressions of emotions based on the muscles and the constellation of muscles. So this would be, for example, could be confused versus, and we're very interested in not so much basic human emotions like anger and joy, but we're more interested in learner-centered emotions that you see in the literature. So boredom, confusion, and frustration. Okay, those are the three that we are very interested in detecting because those are usually negative affective states or emotions that can interfere with learning reasoning. So the question is, imagine right now, we can capture it, we can measure it, we can analyze it. Question is, how will future AI systems be able to diffuse and help a student downregulate those specific emotions? So now they can allocate their cognitive resources to actually the content or the reasoning or the reading and the problem solving that they're supposed to be engaging in. So while this is really great in laboratory, right, this is a very expensive setup, if you will. There's a lot of technology, right, that is here. So we have an issue of scaling up. So if we're going to a classroom, so here, the middle, this young girl and all these kids. So the question is, when we collect this type of data with these learning technologies in the classroom where of 20, 30 students, the question is, we cannot replicate what we do in the lab. So the question becomes, what can we still collect in terms of multimodal data that informs us of self-regulation and learning, et cetera, right? So typically, we could have their facial expressions if the parents give us consent, right? The log file data. In some places in the US, school boards will not allow physiological recording of students, okay? So we have to respect that, of course. And then we have screen recording. So it's basically a minimalist approach, but still some multimodal data, in addition to the pre-test and post-test and self-report measures. Here we have a case where we have a teacher. She's got an EEG, so we also test new technology. She's wearing an EEG. And we're actually presenting the teacher with the multimodal data that we tend to collect from learners, because we want to understand if we, for example, are collecting teachers' eye tracking data or facial expressions, right, as they're observing a student, the question is, what inference is the teacher making about this? And I'm going to come back to that in a second. In some cases, we have students who are using virtual reality environment, as I mentioned before. Here's one of them, and I'll show you some other data. In this case, we have a group of nurses who are intervening on a high-fidelity mannequin. Okay, so the question is looking at the team. So here we're looking more at the discourse. What are the nurses saying? What is the lead nurse saying, or it can also be the lead physician? How is the lead or the most senior person monitoring and regulating the entire team? In most of the cases that we have focused on, these tend to be very critical cases, or what we call end-of-life scenarios. So to basically prepare clinicians to deal with death of humans, right? That is unfortunately part of their profession. The question is, how do they behave and how do they react, and can we augment their training okay, so that they basically are going to be better at saving lives. And then in this case here, we also test new technologies. So the technology here is called tangible computing. It's this blue thing. It looks like a giant cake that's sitting on the table. And this cake, if you will, has kinetic sand, okay, so it has properties. And what you see is a projection of a computational model of the weather in North Carolina. So the blue that you see is the water, and the little dots that you see are the houses. So the model, once the simulation starts, the students are supposed to be using and coordinating, right, with their hands to make barriers, and they get time series data that in near real time, they'll see if they actually inundated the city or not. Okay, so with these new technologies, we're also interested in understanding how, if you notice the student is using the EEG, what is the cognitive load of having to deal with a simulation and a partner and oneself. And also they're wearing the bracelets because we want to see if there's synchronicity. So as part of problem solving and being a good collaborator, the fact that at least physiologically you're synchronized versus dysynchronized. And he's also wearing a portable eye tracker, right? Because we want to see what is he looking at? Is he looking at his hands at what he's doing? Or at what point does he look at her? You know, is there a need to look at her as they coordinate their system? So all these systems, and the question becomes, you know, where does AI play a role in all of these systems, right? How far can we push the envelope? And then if we go to the next slide, please. So in this case, I don't know if the person who's helping me with the slides, can you click? You can't see the video, can you? Yeah, there you go. Perfect. All right. So here we have a student, high school student. Like, look, watch her hands, right? So she's in the VR, right? And you can see here in the monitor, we see what she is looking at and what she's doing, and we see her hands, right? So the question is, as we look at virtual reality, which seems to be, you know, everybody in schools wants to use virtual reality, right? It's still a challenge. It's no longer the economic challenge because it's pretty inexpensive right now compared to years ago. But if we look, we ask very basic questions, right? As opposed to getting really excited about using VR, which is very exciting, but we need to step back and ask fundamental questions that I put in some of these honeycombs, right? Is the student learning? How do we know she is learning? Is she not learning? Do we know why? What is she learning? How do we measure what she is learning, right? Will she retain, utilize, and transfer what she's learned with VR to other task domains and contexts? How long does she need to be and use the VR system to learn? What can we do to scaffold and optimize her learning? So these are fundamental questions because yes, there is a technology aspect. There is not all schools, at least in the United States, have the ability, for example, to purchase VR equipment for, let's say, 20 to 30 students. It's still expensive. Okay, but we ask the fundamental questions. When the student, as you saw in this case, is not talking, so we have no idea what she is looking at, or sorry, verbalizing and thinking about. All we have is what she's doing based on the output of her visor and the gestures. So the question becomes, what do the gestures reveal? Are the gestures a proxy for a learning strategy, such as summarization or integration, etc.? So those are some, again, not to remember, we have to ask fundamental questions. So next slide, please. So in this case that you saw, right, you saw some multimodal data. You had the output of the student's face, right? And you had the gestures. In this case, I'm going to show you very simply the eye tracking data, okay, of a college student. So if you don't mind clicking on it, yes, thank you. So this is a book that is in the Crystal Island series game. And what you are seeing is the live eye tracking data of a college student who's reading this particular 2 pages on viruses, okay? So the question is, what is the relevance? If we gave students access to this data in real time, would they be better learners by understanding what they're reading? If you were a teacher and you got this even small snippet of how a student was reading the content, would this help you as a teacher to understand the reading comprehension processes of a student? And it's not just about the reading. Now the student, after they've read for a while, they have now to indicate very simply the characteristics and activities to show us that they know the difference between viruses and bacteria. And if they got something wrong, right, what kind of feedback would the teacher give? What kind of feedback would an AI be able to give? Okay, and that's just eye tracking and screen recording. Okay, go to the next slide, please. All right, and if you can play the video, I think it's a, yeah. So here is work that we do with teenagers from 14 to 17 years old. We know that statistical reasoning is a huge problem. All right, what you are seeing is the eye tracking, the real-time eye tracking gaze behavior. Okay, so the bubbles and the size of the bubble is the number of the duration of fixation. So they're reading the problem, and then they have to select A, B, C, or D. What the students don't know is that we have worked with statisticians and folks who focus on statistical education. And one of these answers is correct. The other three are misconceptions. So what we're trying to do is understand, can we train an AI to basically be able to detect whether a student has a particular misconceptions about statistics based on their eye tracking behavior? And if they do, it's not just an assessment tool, but the question then is, how would that same AI intervene? Okay, so this is real live, okay, which is very hard, of course, for anybody to interpret, right? This generates data that we analyze. But one of the types of data on the right-hand side that you are seeing, the top and bottom, this is actually the same 15-year-old students, okay? And this is what we call a heat map. So after they've solved the problem, okay, we generate, so they're solving two different problems, the same student. On top, you can see the red is where they fixated most of their attention, followed by yellow, followed by green, okay? You can definitely see the top where the students actually made the correct choice, which is D, okay? Look how much they fixated on D, okay? And look at the clustering of their attention versus same student, a different problem where the student has a misconception, okay? Look at the dispersion of the eye tracking data, okay? They have no idea what is relevant or irrelevant, and we make the inference then that the student is not engaging in accurate metacognition. The question then is, if we had an AI that was behind the scenes, the question is, when would it intervene, how would it intervene, and what kind of guidance would this give to the students? And if we go to the next slide, please. So this is an example of so this is data on medical students, okay? So same thing, so in this case, what you are seeing here is a medical student, okay? We can see how, if they select chest x-rays, how they are examining the chest x-ray, and they have to differentiate and come up with diagnosis for 5 different cases of cough. What you see on the bottom that looks like an EEG is actually the facial expressions of their emotions. It's the level of intensity based on the constellation of facial muscles. So we asked the question, in order to build an AI system following this data collection, right, what is the most relevant data for understanding why, for example, a medical student would not be able to diagnose these 5 cases? Is it their facial expressions of emotions because they're confused or frustrated because they don't understand something? Is it their eye tracking data, okay? Or is it the selection of how they're selecting the data? And all that data is being captured, okay? Next slide, please. So in this one here, so this is to show you the possible data, right? You hear the agent, you see the student, you have the verbalization. Right now they're setting up a learning goal. Notice the diameter, that means the longer the fixation, they're setting up a goal. She gives
How to learn
feedback.
about path of blood flow.
Okay.
Wonderful. We've just set up a good sub goal.
So they set a sub goal, and now we don't tell the student what to read. The student has to make a
So
decision by
suppose
opening the
blood
table of
flow.
contents. Okay. So here the system is monitoring whether they're going to select the right content or relevant content. When they click on it, we get the text and diagram. And notice what the student is doing. A good learner, a good reader will look and read the headings. But here's the interesting thing is that most people don't say, well, now I'm going to open this. I'm going to read the subheading. The subheading says other aspects. The eyes did that. right? So the question becomes, what can the AI do in the absence of a student's verbalization? Here they're taking notes. We can detect if they're just copying information or using a learning strategy. Okay, and this goes on and on. So here's the advantage. You have access to the face, to the body, posture, notes that they're taking, the interaction with the agents, their eye tracking behavior, and the screen recording. And again, most students, okay, so we're also in the process of, we collect this data as researchers. Why not show these videos or clips of these videos to the learners? Because most learners, okay, if you can just pause the video for a second, please, so I can talk over it. Thank you.
In the map, there are severe. They serve several roles. One important role is to maintain blood volume. Yeah. Let's see how I understand
just pause
this.
How well do you feel that you understand the content that you have read on this page?
So the question is, can we imagine a student getting this video? Let's say the student did really poorly, got this video in terms of how they assessed, how they learn, etc., with an AI that actually walks them through and explains what they did correctly and what they did incorrectly and how they can improve on their self-regulatory behavior so they become a better learner. Similarly, imagine that this same video can be shown to a teacher, because how many teachers, regardless of where you live in the world, have access to students' actual learning process that is live or in real time? You know, unfortunately, for example, I know in the States here, teachers are still learning about stuff that is not even scientifically relevant. Like, you know, they learn about learning styles. You know, we got to stop minimizing and talking about stuff that is not scientific. So that's just one example. If you can go into the next slide, please. So in order to build the next generation of AI systems, right, all we've shown you up to now is that, yes, we can focus on the learner or learners, collect our multimodal data. We can analyze the data, which I haven't shown you today. In this video, can you just pause the video for us, please? Thank you. So what I want to show you is that in order to build a next version of AI systems, we need to understand fundamentally what teachers do and understand their processes, because those are the ones that we should be emulating. What I'm showing you in this video that has been set up in a lab, okay, so it's a little bit contrived, is that Michelle here is representing the typical student that you've already seen. She's instrumented. If you look at her elbow, she's got the GSR tracker. She's playing Crystal Island. You're going to see, you know, this is the setup you've seen. This barrier here represents the fact that somewhere, obviously not sitting next to her, it can be in another room, it can be across the world, just like we're doing today, right, is an expert teacher who's also instrumented. We want to study how teachers' multimodal data, of their understanding of the students' multimodal data. That's what this is showing. And if you can play the video, please. So here's Michelle. So we're collecting her multimodal data. And then what this person is, so Nick here is representing what would be a teacher. The teacher would also be instrumented. Okay. And imagine the teacher now has access to the learner's real-time multimodal data, right? And we want the AI to be trained on the inferences that he's making. What student data of Michelle is Nick looking at? How is he analyzing that data? How is he interpreting that data? Okay, and then more importantly, what pedagogical strategy is he intervening? Okay, so next slide, please. So that's kind of where some of the research we're doing now. And so what we've done with our colleagues at North Carolina State here, Liz is representing a typical student. So we've developed a prototype, okay, is the system called MetaMentor. Is imagine training teachers on self-regulation. And so we're now watching this video from the perspective of a teacher, okay? So if I'm the teacher, I get to see Liz, that's her face. I get to see her body, right? Because for a teacher, oh, can you advance the, yeah, thank you. So the question is the teacher looking at the face? Is the teacher looking at her body? And guess what you have? On top, I get to see what Liz is actually doing as she's studying about the human circulatory system, and I have her eye tracking. On the bottom panel, is because we've trained teachers on self-regulation, The idea here is, as I'm watching her learn and all her multimodal data, which is the top panel, is I now as a teacher get to indicate, oh, this student looks bored, and I click on boredom. This student is taking notes. This student is engaging in metacognitive process. Oh, it looks like judgments of learning. So I am collecting the trace data to study teachers' understanding of students' multimodal data. And then the question is, did the teacher actually miss something? Okay. And the teacher on the bottom here, where it says type a message, as a teacher, if this was live, the teacher can actually enter the pedagogical strategy. Hey, Liz, right now, I think you should be moving on to the next subtopic related to, because you've spent enough time and it looks like you understand this content. And that message would be delivered in real time to the student. Okay, so that's some of the work that we're doing. So studying and analyzing teachers' interpretation of students' multimodal data is extremely important. And then if you can skip the next slide and go to the 2 slides from now, please. Yeah, the next one. Yeah. So all that to say that a lot of the research that we're doing, there's a lot of research, especially in the learning analytics community, is on teacher dashboards. So the question is, if we're collecting this multimodal data on teachers, right? So the question is, yes, right now, these students, right, if they're using, let's say, MetaTutor, they can get individualized scaffolding from the AI that's built into this system, right? So they get individualized instruction, pedagogical scaffolding, and feedback. The question is, if this is the teacher in the classroom, how can we show some of this multimodal data to the teachers, right? So we work with teachers in terms of data visualizations. What data from your students do you want to see? Is it emotions, motivation, strategies, etc.? How do we represent that data? When do you want to see that data? Okay, this is assuming that we have sensors in the classroom, okay, and on the teacher. And then the teacher is also instrumented. So we work with teachers to develop the dashboards. And then the question is, as we are developing the dashboard, is now we're going to instrument, we're going to put an eye tracker on you, we're going to put an EEG, we're going to collect your verbalization, because you told us that you wanted access to students' multimodal data in the classroom as part of a dashboard. So now we're going to present that data. And when that data does come up in real time in class, we want to see what data you pay attention to, how do you analyze, how do you interpret, and what inferences you make. And you're closing the instructional loop. Is it effective? Are you actually being effective by having access to this data? So that's some of the multimodal data. Just kind of a very brief snippet of what we do. If we go to the next slide, please. So some of the work that we also do, given some of the issues that we're experiencing here in the US in terms of racial disparities, we need to get more women in STEM fields, in medicine. So what we've done here, and also underrepresented minorities. So what we are also doing is we actually have this grant is under review right now, is to build an immersive environment. So think about the game Fortnite. Now you have, for example, an African-American student, a high school student, okay? And she's hovering over a medical city, right? And she jumps into many of a medical city. So she develops her own avatar. Okay, so that's what this one here, this person here represents, is her avatar that's going to be immersed in that in-game environment. She's able to practice clinical skills. Okay, so in this case, for example, you know, it's learning about COVID and what it does to your lungs. Okay, and because you're not only immersed in this virtual environment, you also have an embedded eye tracker, an immersive environment. We can actually use this not only to see how you assess the patient, but guess what? We actually, again, we have the heat map in that we can use for assessment of students' clinical reasoning, okay, by the fact that you left a trace of what you were how and what you did for examination of the patient. Okay, so that's some of the work that we're currently engaged in as we move in more into immersive environments, and then what role AI should have on these. If we go to the next slide, please. So this one is a project that is funded by the European Association for Research on Learning and Instruction, or EARLY. So our university, University of Central Florida, is the lead university. We have collaborators in Finland, Israel, Turkey, and Germany. And so the idea is, what will the classroom of the future look like? So we were given funding for 2 years to come up with that, and also look at the cross-cultural differences in terms of teachers and teacher training. Okay, so in this case, for example, imagine in the future we have teachers who are planning their lesson using an immersive environment. The top right, number 2, is somewhat of the conception of what the future classroom would look like. There could be a physical teacher, physically present, or a teacher can also be virtual. Some students would be physically present, others would be just an avatar. So think about the metaverse, for example. How is this going to impact the role of AI, and what is the role of AI in this environment? Over here, number 3 is what kind of we envision in terms of, so if they're doing environmental science, right? We live in Florida, in Orlando, so a lot of this has to do, we have SpaceX, we have NASA, et cetera. So a lot of it has to do with space exploration. So for example, imagine a set of teachers. So both you have real teachers and virtual embodied teachers planning, okay, a session. And then number 4 is, because we would have like, if you think about a metaverse type environment, is where we would have artificial agents who are collecting this data, understanding how teachers use these type of technologies to enhance STEM learning, is that you could potentially have artificial agents, right, who could represent us as a scientist, along with teachers or virtual characters of the teachers. And we're looking at some of the data. It could be student data or even the teachers' data in terms of the pedagogical decisions that they've made. So we still have another year on this project. This is still ongoing. And then next slide, please. So again, we're getting to the point where I'm showing you snippets of what things that we are doing in terms of getting humans to externalize. So another one is another game called Future Worlds. In this game is about sustainability, ecology. So students become experts in one of these tiles. So for example, let's say a student wants to learn about phosphates and nitrates in a hog farm, in a pig farm, versus industrial area, versus a nuclear reactor area. So they get access to instructional units. And so the question then becomes, how can we include data visualizations that would facilitate the non-player characters' intelligence in terms of understanding what the students are doing, by having students reveal to them who they are as learners in terms of what they're understanding, what they're not understanding, and what they need to learn more. So the onus is really focusing on not so much getting the AI to make full 100% inferences, because we're not there yet, but it's basically get the learners to externalize what they're thinking about and reasoning and their metacognition and self-regulation, so that the AI is starting to make some advancements in terms of the inferences, because right now it cannot make any inferences just like a human would. Okay. The next slide, please. So this is where we envision, we work with a company called Verbella. You may be familiar. Verbella during COVID created a lot of the conferences that were being held face-to-face were done on Verbella. So it's a city. They have a university city. You can develop an entire city with different types of you can deliver instruction, the bottom left, you can have a small group, etc. So the question is, if we can do this, then is the future of education where, we don't go to class anymore? We have a virtual environment where we basically jump in and talk to our virtual teacher and avatars. We're working in this company specifically in terms of, for example, let's say you're a 10th grade student. It's 10 o'clock in the evening. You're not at school. You don't have access to your teacher. Your friends are not available. Your parents cannot help you with your physics problem. But imagine now, think about the bottom right here in terms of the bullets that I've written, the bottom left, excuse me, is now I jump into this virtual environment, right? And I have virtual metacognitive agents. I explain to the metacognitive, it's almost like when you go to the hospital, right? When you walk into the emergency room, you have the triage, right? They take your vitals, etc., and then they figure out if you need to be seen by a doctor right away or if you can wait. Same kind of concept, but from a pedagogical educational perspective. Right. So then imagine this agent, after you explaining the problem you're having with physics, is that this agent sends you to the metacognition room, where you can get a metacognitive agent who explains to you the metacognitive process that you're having in understanding the physics problem. And so the question is, not only is it able to teach you, but it can also coordinate and communicate and articulate to you and model for you some of the metacognitive processes that you could potentially engage in. Okay. And if we go to the next slide, please. And so before we play the video, 1 second. No, wait. One second. So what I'm going to show you here is some of the other current work that we're doing in terms of viral outbreak. This is a simulation environment to teach scientific reasoning and for students to understand how viruses spread. It's called Outbreak Simulator. It's developed by one of our collaborators at the University of Idaho. And so this video is a very short video that shows you what we're doing, and then I'll explain in terms of what the right-hand side is. And please play the video. Thank you.
In this demonstration, we will discuss epidemiological simulation, which is intended to help identify and correct user misconceptions related to infectious disease and public health. The user can select preset model parameterizations for known pathogens, customize the parameters however they like. The user begins the outbreak at any location on the interactive map. The simulation runs epidemiological compartment models of spatial population data, allowing movement of infected individuals between grid cells. Models can be spatially modulated by additional GIS data layers of disease and public health. The user can select preset model parameterizations for known pathogens or customize the parameters however they like. The user begins the outbreak at any location on the interactive map. The simulation runs epidemiological compartment models of spatial population data, allowing movement of infected individuals between grid cells. Models can be spatially modulated by additional GIS data layers of environmental and social variables, such as topography, water bodies, vaccine testing, and access to healthcare. Here, we show a brief example using a fictitious virus that turns humans into zombies. We assume that the virus transforms an infected person into a shambling man, can infect other people through bites, and travels only by foot. The intensity of the red color represents the relative number of infected zombies. Yellow indicates exposed individuals who have been bitten but not yet turned. Black shows regions of the map that have become depopulated. See that our model predicts a pretty dire outcome for the eastern part of the United States. The West remains unharmed, and the infection burns itself out after about 90 days. Roughly 200 people have died, about 72% of the U.S. population. Alternatively, here's what happens if we let our zombies play. We plan to develop an AI-based verification simulation that misconceptions held by users, customizes their interaction options to best facilitate remediation for that individual.
Yeah, so this is just to give you an example of a very sophisticated population outbreak simulator. And so the question here is to use this. Right now, it has no AI, but the idea is the plan. It looks like we may be getting some funding to 3-year grant to support this, is to use Epic's MetaHumans, which you see 4 examples on the right-hand side, is as NPCs that are embedded in this environment that are able to detect students' inferences, okay, that as they're watching these outbreaks, because they're setting the model, and then they're watching to see how, whether it's through on airplanes or traffic or vaccine distribution, is what role would these agents play in terms of supporting diagnostic reasoning and inferences made, especially because of the complex data visualizations. Now, the new system is also connected to Google Earth, so now you can compare not only state to state in the US, but also the US, for example, versus other countries in the world. Next slide, please. So this one is, before you play the video, so this one is work that we're doing in holographic simulations. You're going to hear the person at the podium is the Associate Dean, Dr. Barry Hoffman. She's the Associate Dean of our College of Health Professional Sciences. And what you're going to see is this what looks like a giant freezer is a doctor hologram, which is a projection that can be done in real time or non-real time. So this is a video just to show you the potential of these new technologies, and then I'll explain a little bit in terms of how we're planning to use AI to do this. So you can play the video, please.
For the first time ever, a university is incorporating hologram technology in the classroom, and it's thanks to technology from a company here in Los Angeles. The University of Central Florida is using the technology that produces a lifelike person in hologram form to help train students going into a healthcare profession. Using a 4K camera, a lifelike patient can be beamed in from anywhere, live or pre-recorded. It's from the LA company Portal.
The pandemic accentuated the need for telehealth and remote learning. New right now at 5, Channel 9's Angela Jacobs shows us how UCF found a way to greatly improve these platforms for healthcare education students, becoming the first in the world to use the technology this way.
This technology takes a patient from anywhere in the world and brings them right into the room, sharing a 3D image of the way they talk, move, or even breathe.
For grad students in Dr. Lauren Bislick-Wilson's classes in language and motor speech disorders,
hello to our friends out there.
Learning is now lifelike.
You really do feel like that person is there, and you can pick up on all of these subtle characteristics that you wouldn't necessarily get just from watching a video.
This portal, dubbed Dr. Hologram, allows virtual patients to join class sharing their wide range of conditions.
Let's go forward again. And then backwards.
Associate Dean Dr. Barry Hoffman worked to get UCF's Holoport to fill pandemic-revealed gaps in remote learning and telehealth.
There's always a challenge in bringing a large number of patients semester after semester in front of our learners. And so this technology and building a library of patient experiences really just fills that gap.
It can also enhance clinical skills across multiple areas of medicine.
I've never been introduced to anything like that before.
This grad student in social work just met her first hologram patient.
I connected with it better than as if I was doing Zoom.
Among UCF's endless portal possibilities, teaching students how to build better patient relationships.
Not only just to assess the symptoms and severity, but to really understand the humanistic component and help these individuals regain quality of life.
In Orlando, Angela Jacobs, Channel 9 Eyewitness News.
Is using hologram technology to train future healthcare professionals. That technology produces a lifelike person, allowing students to see and examine the whole patient. It also allows students to be exposed to patients who are immunocompromised. Training has been limited to pictures and videos of patients. Technology will be implemented into several programs this fall, including physical therapy, athletic training, and clinical social work.
Can you stop the video, please?
New tonight.
Thank you. And go to the next slide. So as we have these technologies, right, the question that comes right away is, how can we use AI in this kind of technology, right? Whether it's a live patient or a patient that's been pre-recorded. So what we've been doing is basically in that College of Health Professions with our team. So here's Darren, one of my postdocs, right? We're trying to figure out, what is the impact of these new technologies on clinical reasoning? Does it enhance clinical reasoning? Does it actually induce more medical errors because of the hyperrealism of the fact that you can see? Right now, you can do everything except palpate. So you cannot palpate and physically examine a patient. However, the plan is to actually use haptics to actually be able to go in, if you will, into the box and actually be able to physically palpate. But what we're doing is actually doing lots of measurements and testing our existing technologies to see how far away, if we're looking at the clinician, if think about Darren here as being the clinician, how far away does she have to be so we can look at her facial expressions as she's examining the patient, okay? What does our eye tracking look like? What does the physiological data look like? And so the question is not only trying to understand the impact of these new technologies on clinical reasoning, but then the question is, can we take the same, for example, if we were to take our eye tracking data in real time and imagine overlaying that real-time data on the screen so that now, if you are clinicians sitting in that room learning, now you have access, as you're learning about clinical decision-making, you have access to the multimodal data of the clinician. So I can see where the physician or the clinician is looking at as she is, for example, examining the patient. The other question in terms of AI is, so the patient that you have here right now and that's on this slide is a survivor of throat cancer. The question is, imagine this is the patient right now. Can we use AI to do disease progression? Show me, in other words, hey, show me, use artificial neural networks to show me what this patient would look like 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, etc. So part of the interest here is, for example, with diabetic patients. So imagine this patient was pre-diabetic. You now have a window to not become diabetic. Okay, so the question is in terms of compliance, because it is a burden on our medical system, right? Especially diabetes and cardiovascular issues, right? So the question is, if Darren here, instead of being the clinician, if she was the patient who has just been diagnosed as pre-diabetic, she's not confronting her, what you see in the box is what she would look like in the future. We would see that years from now, she can see that she's going to become blind. She may have a leg that's amputated, right? So is that strong enough of a message to be able to have patients comply with certain disorders and diseases? And then if you can skip the next two, I'm also trying to be mindful of the time since we started a little late. Skip the next 2 slides, please. Yeah, the next one, yeah. Perfect, yeah. So with this one, so kind of as we're rounding out, I'm trying to be mindful since, I have like 13 minutes left. I'm going to leave questions. Is that we're asking some very basic fundamental questions, right, in terms of advances in AI and self-regulation. So one is, can they solve ill-structured problems that have multiple solutions, right? Can they collaborate with humans to solve societal challenges? So for example, can they digest, if you will, all the data, epidemiological data that exists all over the world, right, to solve and perhaps anticipate the next pandemic, and what would that look like? In the middle is, because one of the themes of our research is emotions and affective computing, right? Can they learn to feel emotions and develop empathy? A lot of the work that we're doing now is on empathy. How do we teach medical students empathy? How do we teach teachers to be empathetic to students, right? We have many students here from many different communities who come to school hungry, who come to school without a family, who are homeless, right? And so then here you are as a teacher in the classroom expecting the student to learn, and they're lucky that they made it to school without, being shot. So is learning really the most important thing for that child? We need to understand to be more empathetic, okay, to be able to understand their life situation. So can they feel emotions? Can they articulate their feelings, right? And then more importantly, as our new work on human digital twins, which involves the creation of replicas of humans, right, for really any kind of human, is can they learn and perform? Can they modify their own behavior? And then can they explain complex things that we as humans have problems with because of our being biological organism, having limited attention? And so we continue to ask in all of our projects and all our work with, either local, national, international collaborators and interdisciplinary researchers, we keep asking the same fundamental questions. What does it mean to be intelligent? Where does the intelligence reside? How do we know artificial beings are intelligent? What are the disciplines that are needed to advance the science of artificial intelligence systems? How will AI and the beings impact our lives and education? And then, of course, more importantly, never to forget, is that at the root of all this, we need to constantly monitor and regulate these AI systems, because there are ethical, moral, social, and economic issues, privacy issues, bias issues that we need to consider as, things like ChatGPT become really, truly unruly, if potentially, and going to impact our society. And then if you can skip the next 2 and go to the last slide, please. I'm trying to, that would be the last slide to present. And yeah, so this is, obviously this work is not possible without, the funding agencies, our current and former members of our lab, and of course our national and international collaborators. And I thank you for your attention, and I guess we'll open it up to questions. Thank you so much.